Hello and welcome back to another episode of Your Queer Story. We're sitting in the studio following up on last week. We haven't left.
No.
I've drinking an entire large Red Bull and also a very large mug full of coffee, so I'm probably going to be very caffeinated for this episode. It's all going to come out at once and I'm going to spiral.
Paul is ready to go. I'm looking forward to it. I'm on my third glass of Diet Coke. I had 2 cups of coffee earlier today. Could use another one, but can't stop. Got to get done because...
Take the time when you have it.
There's
Go.
I know, right? Too much going on in the world. So it took well over 2 years, but we finally decided to cover the IFB, Independent Fundamental Baptists.
Yep.
So that's fun.
I'm glad we've been waiting for the bigger things. Like, I'm glad we waited for the AIDS epidemic. I'm glad we waited for this because... we have evolved, and you've especially evolved in your research and your writing skills. So it's good that we've waited for these heavier subjects because you now have... what was I going to say? You've educated yourself, you've learned, you've trained, you've practiced, and you've really honed the art of how to combine all of them into a well-researched and written script.
Well,
so
I appreciate that.
I'm glad we've waited and evolved, and we've both evolved as hosts, and...
Yeah.
We've evolved in our way we deliver things, so it's good. Now I feel going forward, I feel confident that we can cover any topic and really cover it.
Yeah, I agree. And I really did like researching this because even though I knew a lot of this stuff, it really tied it all together and reaffirmed the way I feel it. Because when you grow up in a cult and you grow up in these kind of environments...
It's not that bad. Right? That's what you think.
Well, yeah, you think it's not that bad.
This is normal.
Exactly. You also get gaslit into... Exactly. I was going to say. You get gaslit into thinking it wasn't that bad. It wasn't that extreme. I blew it out of proportion.
Right.
And then you go back and you redo the research on it and you're like, no, I was right. Like, this was as bad as I thought it was. In fact, it was worse than I thought it was.
And I'm actually... I didn't grow up in that environment. I grew up in my own, but... I'm starting to come to terms with, okay, I did have a pretty crazy childhood. I did have a lot of shit that went on that I don't want to say most people don't go through, but, it's the same thing. Oh, that's just how my childhood, it wasn't that bad. I made it. Like, here I am today. I'm successful. It wasn't that bad. And then through therapy and through my own learning, not only about my mental illness, but also like past traumas and things, I'm like, okay, actually it was pretty bad. And I've always thought I don't have any dark places to pull inspiration from because great works have always been pulled from darkness and sadness and really honed. And I'm like, I don't have those places. I've never been there. And I'm like, I actually do.
Yeah. Well, I've always been very surprised in the past about your, your casualness about your
I think it was a survival technique where I was just like, oh no, it wasn't bad. Here I am. Like, everything was fine. And then when I really start to dig through and think about it, I'm like, it's kind of eye-opening almost in a way. And I'm sure the same thing for you. Oh
yeah. Yeah. It was years before I could say that I grew up in a cult. And it was years before it really started to sink in how bad things were. It's what we're both talking about. The same thing of like, not that big a deal. So what? Okay. Maybe it's more aggressive. Maybe it was worse in this area, but everybody has shit, right?
Yeah,
exactly. We downplay and we minimalize what we've been through as a coping mechanism, and that serves us for a while. But eventually, if we don't address it, it hinders us from growing further.
Right, exactly, and it makes it hard to empathize with other people too, because you're like, well, it wasn't that bad for me, so you're gonna be fine, and it does. It puts a blanket over empathy where you still have it. You definitely feel bad for people, but you can't fully empathetically meet that person's needs because you haven't addressed your own problems and realized what you've been through.
And also, it justifies your abuse, your continued abuse, because it goes with, that's a standard in the IFB of like, well my parents beat me when I was little, and so of course I beat my kids, you know, and with just like the horrible, like in the last episode we talked about, trigger warning, people being chained to drain pipes and being whipped with leather whips and being locked up for up to a month in a solitary confinement where they're not allowed to shower. They have to urinate in the room. And the idea that was okay because of whatever your childhood had been through.
Exactly.
Like Lester Roloff would talk about how his daddy whipped him, and so that's why he whips people. And it still plays. It still plays in the IFB. My parents were violent to me, so I'm violent to my children, and it's okay because I turned out okay. And the fact that I'm a grown-ass adult beating a little child makes sense to me. It's like, it's that, all of that. And then even in other areas, like the wanting gay people to die and be put to death, and like, again, all that violence, all that trauma that's not treated, and you believe it's okay and it's natural, it's normal.
Right.
So today we are going to be talking about actually the man that had the most influence on my life. He was my leader until 2001 when he died, and then his son-in-law became my leader until I left the IFB. So I know a lot about this one. This was the exact world that I grew up in. Like, the IFB as a whole is like a world, and I actually grew up in this church.
Right. In this particular, under this ruler, this is your world that you knew.
This was mine. Yep.
So we're going to be covering Jack Hyles, who did rule the IFB from 1969 to 2001.
Which, again, this is just there were a lot of people that were in charge. I don't want to just say there's no person in charge of the IFB. Mm-hmm. I'm just saying, if you were to put who was the top of fundamentalism, I would put Jack Hyles. Some people might put a John R. Rice or Lester Roloff until the 80s. There's some other guys. Bob Jones Sr. gets thrown in there, but he was later. But he was before Hiles. So I'm not saying
it's not like the leader of the Vatican. It's not the Pope.
Exactly. He's not the Pope.
He is someone who you could consider to be at the top of it.
In fact, people have called him the Pope of the IFB. Yeah. So that's his level of power. So again, this is my own list of who I see as led it, but I feel like I have some pretty substantial evidence. I think
you also have some pretty substantial experience.
I do have a substantial experience too. So go ahead.
So, a Norris fanboy, and when we say Norris, we're referring to
J. Frank Norris from our first episode.
And good friend of Roloff, who was also covered in the first episode, was already well on his way to the IFB stardom when Roloff passed. Jack Hyles was born the same year as J. Frank stood trial for murder in 1926. Hyles' early life seemed to mirror that of Norris. Jack was born in poverty and the son of an alcoholic who beat him severely and eventually left the Hyles family altogether. Like Norris before him, Hyles found comfort in the world of the fiery Baptist preaching. After serving in the army during World War II, Hyles returned from World War II and attended East Baptist Bible College in Marshall, Texas. He then pastored a few churches in Texas, and his success drew the attention of a large congregation in Hammond, Indiana, great old Hammond, which, before we get going, I don't understand when you say someone pastored a few churches. What does that mean?
Oh, I'm sorry. So,
because it's come up 5 times now, and every time I'm like, I'll understand it eventually.
I always forget that you know nothing about church world.
Does that mean he was the head of a church?
He was the leader of a church, so he would lead a church here, and then he would lead a church there. Sometimes,
and why would he leave? Why do you go from church to church? To grow? Do you go from you start out at a crappy church and then you're like, I'm a good church and I molested a few children here. Now I'm going to pastor this church and I'm going to molest a few children here and then I'm going to get moved again.
So depending, for the most part, it's kind of like a career advancement. If you his first church, he built it up to a couple hundred people. Then he went to another church, built it up to a couple thousand people. And so then there was this large, very well-established church in Hammond and they recruited him to come to their church. So it'd be like moving up the ladder career-wise.
Right. So you run this store. Okay, this is in a crappy location. Then you get to run this nicer store, and then eventually you get promoted to being this store. Okay,
and but again, that's if it's ideally. There's also pastors who are constantly being kicked out of their churches, and so then they go find another church to pastor and they just pastor one small church after another.
So, seeing the potential and the money of the wealthy and well-respected church, Hiles took the position at First Baptist Church of Hammond, Indiana, in 1959. Which, if you know anything about the area today, I don't want to necessarily say that Hammond itself is very poor, but the area in general, Northwest Indiana, is pretty poor. So I'm assuming in the 50s and 60s around this time, the steel mills were probably pretty popular. And there was, because there did used to be a lot of money in the area when the steel mills and factories and things were going, before everything was outsourced. So there probably was, at this time, it was probably a really poppin' area.
It was very wealthy. Yeah, that's what a lot of people don't know. Gary, Indiana, in a matter of 20 years, went from being one of the wealthiest places in the Midwest to being one of the most poverty-ridden places in the Midwest.
So, and in this time, it's just a great opportunity, I'm sure, is what I was trying to say.
Yeah. For him to leave the South, which was a huge deal for Hiles, you knew there was a big allure to it. So go ahead.
By age 33, he had become somewhat popular in the South, yet the move to Hammond was the real catalyst for Jack Hyles' career. It was here that he created an empire and a worldwide name as far as the IFB goes. It was also here that he created what most experts have classified as a cult.
Few have ever understood the world of fundamentalism better than Jack Hyles, and this is why I put him as probably the most pivotal person of the time, because whether you were before Hyles or whether you were after Hyles, he is like a god in the IFB. Even people that hate everyone else, like he's a god, he's a demon, like he's either the great divider or he's the great like uniter in the world of fundamentalism. And he really understood the fundamentalist line of thought. His ability to exploit the fears and anxieties of people who already have a deep distrust of government and systems was uncanny. It is no doubt that played a part in Hyles breaking away from the American Baptist Convention shortly after arriving at the FBC of Hammond. Just like Norris had despised the organized Southern Baptists for mocking his exaggerated showmanship, Hyles despised the American Baptists for the same reason. Both men hated the scrutiny and constraint that an oversight committee placed upon them, which is the process in most Christian denominations. They wanted to have complete control. In fact, it seems that most IFB leaders are men who refuse to answer to others, but expect their followers to answer solely to them.
It's a cult leader.
Exactly, right? It's crazy. Like, think of Roloff refusing to let anybody come in and see his homes. But if you so much as rolled your eyes at him, he'd take you in another room and whip you mercilessly. It's that idea, that level of cult control. I don't have to answer to anyone else, but you have to answer completely and fully to me. While the reasons were certainly complex, at the center, Jack Hyles' drive for authoritarianism drove him to the independent fundamental Baptist.
And the break served Hyles well. He too built his Sunday school to earn the coveted honor of largest Sunday school in the world by Christian Life magazine. And Time magazine ran an article on Hyles in December of 1975 titled Super Church. The notoriety was only beginning as Jack Hyles became the darling of the fundamentalist world. He established 2 Baptist schools, a radio program, a mission, a publishing company, the Christian Womanhood newspaper organization, along with countless other endeavors. His most lasting impact, though, was his college, which he named after himself and his donor, Russell Anderson. Hyles Anderson College boasted an attendance of 2,700 at the height of its popularity, and its first president was Robert Billings, who is quite a fundamentalist in his own right. Billings once estimated that he had helped to start more than 400 Christian schools across the United States, which serves as further proof of long-lasting arms and interconnectedness of the IFB. After leaving his post at Hyles Anderson, Billings went to join Jerry Falwell in creating the moral majority and helping Reagan to win the presidency. This earned him a spot in the education department of Reagan's administration, as well as the president's direct tie to the fundamentalist movement. And because he had such fundamentalist ties, when I was warning people about ignoring the fundamentalists and things and seeing the rise in Poland, we saw this rise here with Reagan. And because Reagan was so influenced by these people, he let countless people die during the AIDS epidemic because he could never imagine crossing the line and saying, well, we have to help the gays. Yep,
exactly. Well, and that's the thing about men like Reagan and men like evangelicals, and I'm going to talk about it in a second. But so like in that world, there's evangelicals, which are the ones that usually get a lot of the notoriety because they know how to make their message slightly more palatable, but their beliefs at the core are fundamentalists. And I'm going to read it because it's just good. Hyles loved that he had what he believed was a direct line to the president. Even though Reagan likely knew very little about Jack Hyles, having a friend such as Billings so close to the president gave Jack all the ego boost he needed. In his mind, he was the close friend of the president, and he was directly responsible for keeping America in line. And to be fair, both Reagan and Hyles had a lot of beliefs and goals in common. Like the leaders before him, Hyles preached against Catholics, communists, feminists, and evolutionists, a term he often used. He wholeheartedly supported segregation and was an open racist, though he believed that because he tried to convert black people to his teachings, though he believed that because he tried to convert black people to his teachings, he couldn't possibly have any prejudice. In truth, he created separate Sunday schools just for black and Latino kids and kept the classes segregated until his death in 2001. He was also a lifelong open opponent of interracial dating or marriage and blamed black folks for the discrimination they faced.
Sounds pretty fucking accurate to a lot of the stuff we grew up like in Indiana. Even though I wasn't a part of that church, the school I attended wasn't segregated, obviously, because it was a public school.
Yeah.
But a lot of the same ideology that people of color, especially black people, were responsible for their own problems. If they just followed the law, if they would just do this, if they would just act like a good old white boy, that was still very prevalent in the state of Indiana when I lived there.
Yeah.
And even outside of the church, I saw that, not from my family per se, but from places I would be, from businesses I would go to, the things that these people would say, it was very much in line with that belief.
Yep, exactly. Yeah, and I don't even know if you realize how much Hyles' influence over that area was.
I don't, even to this day, I probably still don't grasp the concept.
That's what I mean. That's just saying, I'm not saying all of that was him. Indiana is just a racist place, but a lot of that area was saturated with his thoughts and his beliefs, and he had hands in the pockets of everyone. With the new era, there was a new threat to the American dream, and while Norris had disguised his homophobia and anti-communism, Hiles would have no need to do the same. In 1969, as Hiles received his first bit of national fame over his large Sunday school, the gay rights movement burst forward with the Stonewall riots. The subsequent marches and open demand for LGBTQ+ equality sent a shiver down the backs of those in the fundamentalist movement. This was a new target added to sit next to the great threats of evolution and communism. Whereas many communities grow and evolve in their missions and focus, fundamentalists pride themselves in never changing the things they hate, only adding to the list. The fear-mongering discourse around the so-called gay agenda became part of Hyles' daily repertoire during his communications to his followers.
While leaders like Billy Graham and Jerry Falwell led the mainstream evangelical march against the LGBTQ, Jack Hyles and his cohorts led the world of fundamentalism. In the media, Graham and Falwell spoke against queer rights, but still admonished love and sympathy for the sick homosexual. Though privately, they were just as hateful as fundamentalists. It is exactly this form of two-faced hypocrisy, often shown in the world of evangelicalism, that drove many people to the brazenly open IFB. Say what you will about the fundamentalist, they will always tell you exactly what they are thinking, even if it is a stream of incoherent, hate-ridden, nonsensical thought. Yet, though, Jack Hyles' reasoning was a rabbit trail of disconnected ideas, he could certainly articulate his thoughts. In his infamous sermon, Is Homosexuality Sick or Sinful?, Hyles stated, "It is very plain!" Can't yell on the podcast because it'll ruin everything, though.
Yeah.
It is very plain, then, that God is displeased with homosexuality. He not only tells us that it is a sin, but that under the Jewish law it was punishable by death. It is not surprising, then, to find that the same generation that demands an acceptance of homosexuality has also rejected God's teaching concerning homosexuality. According to the Bible, it is sin and not sickness.
Even got a picture in the thing. If you ever look up the script of his little pamphlet that he sent out with his sermons, he'd have him summarize and print it. The rest of the sermon, later summarized into a pamphlet and distributed, gave parents tips on how to cure or prevent homosexuality. Hyles, and there's a link in here, you can just read it online if you want to, it's fun. Hyles blamed loneliness, stating, "Many homosexuals like to spend hours alone in front." Oh, I wish I could do it. I have his voice stuck in my head and I can't put it out.
I feel like that voice in your head has to be so triggering.
It is.
Because
right?
you want to mimic it for the podcast, but also like you're like hearing his voice.
Exactly. It's like hearing his voice, but it's also just ingrained into me. He would do this cough and go, "Many homosexuals now like to spend hours alone with a stereo or enjoying some other recreation that does not require the presence of anyone else." He followed that paragraph with his tremendous ability to weave and control an early brainwashing, telling parents they should immediately put their newborns in the nursery upon their first church service. "The mother is off on the wrong foot when she brings her little boy to church, keeps him in her arms, and refuses to put him in the nursery with the other babies," Hyles raged, adding, "He should become accustomed to being away from his mother and father."
So he really also didn't like introverts.
No, he didn't like introverts. He believed that they were like homosexuals. He also, but like there was this thing where like he wanted the parents to have control, but he constantly worked to put himself as a wedge between the child and the parent because he needed to, when the child was old enough, break that bond and pull the child to him, so that if the parents left, if the parents questioned him, he had control over the children because he understood he had to have that younger generation to keep his dream alive,
to keep it going, because once that next generation goes, if they're not under his control, they're going to be like, what the fuck did my parents bring me into, and get the fuck out.
Yeah.
Point blank.
Exactly.
Example.
Exactly.
The reality is, Hiles knew that indoctrination from an early age was important, and that was why he placed such a large emphasis on Sunday school. Not only could the children have their minds molded by Hiles' trained teachers, who read off plans he created himself and taught the Sunday school teachers before Sunday morning.
He would just do this. He would, on Wednesday nights, he would have to come to church early. He would read, he would give you a plan. This is what you're going to teach in Sunday school. He would then teach the plan. And then you took that plan, how he taught it, and took it back and taught it at Sunday school.
Well, that's an easy ass job. You don't have to think for yourself at all.
Well, yeah, of course. You're not supposed to. You're not supposed to. But he couldn't talk to everybody because there'd be thousands of people across the church property. And the church auditorium wasn't big enough to accommodate all of them. So he'd have to teach it to people that he trusted to then teach it to others.
But this also served to keep the adults' attention on Jack during the sermons and not distracted away from him by their children. Hiles was also a firm believer that a new mother should return to church within weeks, if not days after birth, and it was not uncommon for FBC Hammond to have babies as young as 2 weeks old in the nursery, which eventually called for a dedicated newborn and infants nursery. And just as Hiles indoctrinated and molded his people, he urged his followers to mold their children straight.
Yeah, so I mean, and so like again, all of that. So what I was saying about the Sunday schools is that so you weren't allowed to have children. I think I put it in here under the age of 5 in the services, but that was partly like you were going to indoctrinate them in something that they can understand, but also the parents aren't being distracted by their kids, and I can have their full attention. Right. Important and brilliant. Mm-hmm. Hiles placed the burden of queer kids directly on the parents, teaching for any and every reason a child could become gay, or directly on the parents, reaching for any and every reason a child could become gay. After one mother mentioned she had bought a pool table for her son, Hiles told the audience, "Now, I'm not speaking against pool tables. I don't play pool, and for that matter, neither does my son. I did advise her to get some games that could not be played alone. For example, ping pong is better than pool as it is impossible to be played alone. It is sad nowadays that our boys are growing up nowadays without ever playing ball in a vacant lot or enjoying other privileges that other generations have had to help them avoid feminine tendencies."
As if not... It's this weird thing, almost like a buddy system. Like, don't ever leave anybody alone. Make sure everybody's always with somebody so that everybody can watch everybody. Uh-huh. And it's... if you haven't seen The Handmaid's Tale, but they do this because they send the handmaids out to get groceries, but the handmaids always have to have a friend that goes with them, and that friend watches them, and they watch each other, and then if one of them acts out of line, they will report it.
Exactly. That's exactly true. We always need to know what you're doing, and we're going to pass it off as we're just trying to save you from being queer, because if you're off by yourself, but the reality is if you're off by yourself and maybe away from his teaching for 5 fucking seconds, you might realize I'm in a cult. So I've got to make sure I keep you constantly active. That's why you work people until they're exhausted. Mm-hmm. Constantly give them something to do.
Don't give them any free time to think.
Exactly.
Thinking is the devil.
Always around other people, always with a fellow brethren to keep them encouraged in the word of God. There's also the I don't know where I went to. Oh, I was just thinking because he blamed the parents. If your child is gay, it's because of you. Mm-hmm. And that was a thing that my mom to this day still struggles with, because she constantly looks for what she did to make
you the
me
way you are.
Exactly. Constantly looks for it. And you know. Anyways.
Though transgender and non-binary issues were not prominent in most of the media of the day, Hiles' transphobia and binary thinking shone through regularly. Like countless before and after him, Jack conflated sexual orientation with gender identity. He told his congregation this story in an attempt to terrify them. "I am thinking of a man in our church who is one of the most masculine men I know. But when his boy was very small, his son began to develop feminine tendencies. I saw these tendencies developing. The father, who was masculine, was busy. Though he was every bit a man, he didn't spend enough time with his boy. The boy began to walk like a girl and talk like a girl, and frankly, I am frightened when I think of his future." Which, what does that even mean? Walk and talk like a girl. I don't like. Did he have like a little sway in his hips? And if he has a little sugar in the tank, he's gonna have a little sway in the hips. That's all I gotta say.
Exactly. Also, the constant consistently in that one paragraph reaffirming how masculine the father was,
which is very strange. I'm assuming if he knows how masculine the father was, he was the father's bitch. I'm just gonna throw that out there. If he's the most manly man I've ever known.
A top, you might say. Anyways, all right. Hiles have been railing against choice of words. Hiles had been preaching against the bending of gender norms since early 1969, when he had preached and then printed his sermon, "Jesus Had Short Hair." In a message, he stated, "It is very interesting that as the trend towards long hair on men increases, the acceptance of homosexuality increases. This is not to say that homosexuality and long hair always go together, but it is to note the fact that both are on the rise in our generation." 4 years later, in his sermon titled simply "Unisex," Hiles dramatically declared, "One of the greatest sins of the end times is the fact that unisex movement is sweeping this country." It is hard to know if Hiles blamed this movement more on the feminists, the communists, or the LGBTQ, as he interchanged between the three sets frequently during his rant.
It seems almost as though he is referring to a greater... there's a hair here that is really annoying me. A greater increase in... a greater decline in toxic masculinity.
Oh, yeah.
And I think that in his mind... I mean, this time was still very... horribly toxic, and it still is toxic masculinity, but I mean, he sees something that isn't toxic masculinity, and he's like, that's the devil, that's going to end the world right there.
Well, and again, in this fear of this, it's such an extreme homophobia and fear of LGBTQ. Because he's been with this masculine man. Yes, exactly.
I'm telling you, that's what I already know it deep in my heart. He was secretly gay.
He was. I don't think he was. I really don't.
He was definitely taking some D from the masculine people, and it was just God's work. Any cult leader has crazy sex things, and I am telling you right now that this crazy cult leader had crazy sex things.
He's telling them, he's like, so I bent him over there, and I fucked him right there, and I said, "Do you like it? You like that?" And he didn't like it, and then now he's straight.
I had to make sure. I had to convert him.
No, what was I gonna say? My point is, it's the homophobia though that reeks through all of it. Because I mean, again, why are you afraid of communists? Because you believe communists are queers. Why are you afraid of feminists? Because feminists defy toxic masculinity, and if we can't be toxically masculine, then we might, like boys.
You might as well be gay.
Might as well be boys. Yeah, might as well be gay. So it's all rooted in homophobia. When you trace it back, I mean, honestly, everything in America you can trace back to racism or homophobia or both. Every little bit goes back to one of those two issues.
Throughout the message, he laid out what he called the devil's strategy in utilizing the unisex movement. Point 1. The devil is using clothes to break down the barrier between the sexes. And he wasn't simply talking about clothes designed for men and women. Hiles believed that pants on women was a sin. He told his deacons, "It's time for some of you deacons' wives to look like ladies instead of men. It's time for some of you deacons to yank them up and say, 'Put a skirt on and take those breeches off.'" Which, isn't there something in the Bible about fabric and sin? Like you can't have multiple fabrics. He's trying to tie that in or something.
There's that a woman should not wear that which pertaineth to a man.
Yeah, but there's also something like you can't have like 3 or 4 different fabrics mixed.
You're talking about. Oh yeah, people use that a lot though, because when they're combating, like it's in the same book that says that a man should not lie with a man, and it also says you shouldn't eat shellfish. And
yeah, that's what
exactly. It's all these dumb rules. Yeah. He continued his raging a few paragraphs later, ironically supporting the exact points against the gender construct. "Did you know that you can buy pantyhose for men in shopping centers in the..." Sorry, sometimes I crack him up. All right. "Did you know you can buy pantyhose for men in shopping centers in the city of Hammond? I'm sorry, for males. I'm sorry for its. Hold it. Tell me a scripture that says it's wrong for a man to wear pantyhose. How many of you think it's wrong? I do. Tell me why. It's wrong then because pantyhose are ladies' clothing. Is that right?" then the same philosophy will change your pants to skirts. If it's all right for a woman to wear breeches, then it's all right for a man to wear pantyhose, because it's woman's clothing and a man's not supposed to wear woman's clothing. I say again, if you teenage girls and ladies can wear your slacks, then it's okay for men to wear pantyhose. It's the same philosophy. It's the same logic. You cannot logical and refute that statement. He added later, I'll just say it again. It's time some of the Christians start dressing like fundamentalists. I don't know what's wrong with this statement. We're like,
first of all, I have never seen pantyhose marketed to men. And I'm
in
like,
fucking Hammond, Indiana in the 1970s. Shut up,
right.
Jack.
They're going in, you know how for women pantyhose they have like the rack and there's all the little different boxes. Just imagining like seeing a man's section where there's just like leg hair sticking through all of them.
Which would be great, but they're not going to do it. Yeah.
No, but what I'm saying is like, nobody saw this. He's just completely made this up. And then the fact that he's completely trying to say like, well, if a man can wear if a woman wears that, then men are going to do this, and then that's going to be the downward spiral of our country. It's going to be ruins America.
I just love that he's like, well, if you can wear pants, then men can wear pantyhose, and people are like, yeah, that's basically what we're saying.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're right. I don't know. Just take that clip out and start using it to convince people.
Oh my God, that would be a great clip to take out. The great teachings.
Just do that.
Yeah.
Jack Hyles supported abolishing the binary.
There you go. Throughout his entire life, Hiles would preach the same message, never wavering. He pushed his congregation to actively hate queer people and vote against their human rights. More disturbingly, Hiles sent queer teens in his cult away to the Roloff homes, and later to other troubled teen homes such as Agape, Hepzibah House, Bethel, New Beginnings, and homes run by Straight Inc. Great name.
Yeah.
Hyles' close friends with Roloff certainly influenced his belief that violence would remedy the homosexual problem. Upon Lester's death, Hyles bought the wrecked plane and created a shrine to Roloff at Hyles Anderson. More than 17 years after Jack Hyles' death.
Hang on one second before I get to that. So
let me finish the sentence?
Because, well, it goes to another thought, and I should have separated it. It goes to another thought, and I should have separated it. So, if you remember from our last episode, Lester Roloff started all the homes for teens.
Yes, and he flew his plane and crashed it because he got smitten by God.
This is true. It's a true story because I was in this plane several times in my life.
You were in the plane? Oh, yeah, the shrine.
Yeah, because Hyles took the wrecked plane and he made this little shrine to Lester Roloff. Mm-hmm. And then it stayed like over by our bus barn forever, and there was like a little plaque and you could sit into it. So when I was a kid, I grew up like playing in this wrecked plane and hearing about how poor Lester died and God took him too soon. And then when Hyles died, they made what was called Hyles Park, and in that park they moved the plane. So this was the only point in all of Hyles Anderson where you could actually, there were no cameras and no one could see where you would go. So that's where all the kids would go to get their like hand jobs, because that was the only place that you could go.
The plane?
Yeah, the plane.
The plane where people died?
Lester Roloff's plane was just like one blowjob after another. Just like jizz all over that place. If you put a black light in it, it would just been like one white glob.
Oh my God.
It was great. Anyways.
So more than 17 years after Jack Hyles' death, his son David Hyles was still encouraging some kind of cure for homosexuality, though not as aggressive.
I love this. The younger Hyles wrote in 2018 about the evils of sexual attraction and unnatural lifestyle. In a bizarre blog post, which I have linked for you, he stated, "If I may be so frank, I'm attracted to horses. However, I have never had a sexual attraction to a horse. Yet there are some who have. Why? Because their minds become deviant."
He was getting fucked by horses.
He's so absolutely had sex with a horse. They have allowed their minds to be filled with lustful, wicked thoughts. Sexual attraction is programmed by what we put into our minds or allow us to be put into our minds. We must first give our body as a living sacrifice. Then we refuse to be conformed to the sexual activities of the world. And finally, transformation or metamorphosis takes place in our minds. What once was a deviant sexual attraction becomes merely an attraction. No longer is the sexual a part of it. Therefore, a man who has same-sex attractions can be attracted to men without sexuality. without sexuality being involved. This is how someone comes out of an unnatural lifestyle and is able to live a life that is pure. They must understand the importance of committing their bodies to the Lord.
So he wrote this after he had sex with a horse and felt guilty. That's literally what I'm taking away. Like
I don't know what the fuck mind trip he was on when he wrote that. It's like, what? I don't even know what you're saying. It's just like his dad with the pantyhose, where you're like, wait, what the fuck are we talking about anymore? Because I don't know.
Yeah, it was
where did the horses come from?
It was a very bizarre and very strange, like you said. Like I don't know where his mind was at when he wrote that, because it's very. I don't know. I would never write about being attracted to a horse. I'm just going to throw that out
what
there.
Is the... I mean, first of all, there's like this obscene thing of where, like, you know, they put anybody who's not in a heteronormative relationship
on such extreme animals.
Exactly. It's such extreme, explanations. But David Hyles, we'll talk a little bit more about him. He's a special person anyways.
Mm-hmm. What is particularly disturbing about the Hiles attacks on the deviancy of the queer community was their actual deeds of sexual misconduct. Assault, rape, and abuse of their church members and funds. In 1989, a fundamentalist newspaper known as the Biblical Evangelist broke a story known as the saddest story we have ever published. Eventually, what was meant as a one-time article turned into a 150-page expose on the cult of Jack Hyles and the First Baptist Church in Hammond. In it, journalist Robert Sumner detailed a nearly 20-year-long affair between Jack Hyles and his secretary, along with Hyles forcing the husband of the secretary to live in the basement before Jack eventually used church funds to build his lover a home one street behind Hyles' own. In addition to this bombshell were several others, including multiple allegations of embezzlement and misappropriation of funds, threats and violence against former church members who tried to expose the truth about Hyles, large payoffs made in the form of new vehicles and down payments on homes for those who helped Hyles cover his tracks, and the letters of Hyles' young goons who threatened to attack Sumner for exposing Jack's cult. Today, one of those goons, Eddie Lapina, is the right-hand man at FBC Hammond.
Yeah, it was, I mean, for someone who's not involved in the fundamentalist world, it would just be like, I don't know if I'm reading a fantasy novel or what, but I didn't read that letter, obviously, until, I mean, years after. Yeah,
I'm sure that came out when you're in the church. You were like, what kind of horrible...
That came out the year after I was born. It came out in 1989. Which is what it really blows my mind, because in 1989, they started saying, hey, we have, and I mean, when I say this guy was detailed, I mean like all of his what we call receipts were laid out. He named names. He just laid it like, I have this here and I have this bank statement. And this is before you can just like link things to websites. Right. Like he prints it all out, shows copies of letters written to him, everything. And I mean, it's like, in my mind, like you can't, like the majority of stuff you couldn't refute. It was all right there. But of course, Jack Hyles' response, he prints Jack Hyles' response, then he prints his response to Jack Hyles, and it just goes back and forth. Wow. But the thing about it, so this was a bombshell. And of course, this is where you know that it is a cult, because in the average place, when a bombshell like that hits, most people at the very least make their pastor step down, right? They're like, hey, we noticed that for 20 years you've been having an affair with your secretary. You built a house behind your own. Her husband's coming forward talking about how, the husband's coming forward and admitting he made me live in my basement, wouldn't let me do anything, made me a cuckold, and his children are coming forward saying all of this is true. And nothing happens. In fact, yeah. Well, Jack Hyles forbids his people to read the report, and then everybody at the time wears these little pins that say 100% Hyles, which means that they support Hyles 100%, and just like buries the whole thing.
Wow.
But Jack Hyles wasn't the only one with sins to cover up. Multiple lawsuits were presented against the church over the years as one account of sexual abuse after another was brought forward. One of the most notorious cases was that of Deacon A.V. Ballinger, who was accused of molesting a 7-year-old girl. During the trial, 3 women testified that the deacon had assaulted them as well when they were younger. Hyle staunchly defended Ballinger and even threw a fundraiser and later a party for the deacon. You can watch a clip of it on YouTube. In the end, Ballinger was sentenced to 5 years in prison. A study conducted around this time linked sexual assault cases to 5 different fundamentalist churches back to Hyles. A Northwest Indiana Times article reported allegations of child molesting, abuse, and sex and sex scandals in several churches across the nation appear to be part of a pattern of such scandals among churches affiliated with the First Baptist Church of Hammond.
And when people are constantly like, how could the United States elect a man who went on tape and talked about grabbing a woman by her pussy, and how that they'll let you do it because you're famous, and just all of the links to Jeffrey Epstein and everything. And, and then you get Joe Biden too. How could the United States elect people like this? And it's because this is what they grow up in. Yeah. It's this underground network that if you're part of, you know of. And if you don't, if you're not part of it, you have no idea it exists.
Exactly.
You might have some understanding that, oh, there's those crazy church people, but you don't understand the breadth and the groundwork that there actually is behind it.
And we excuse it, and we say that doesn't apply to me, or we don't do our own research. You know, it's like all these people, like people were standing outside for decades screaming about the abuse happening in First Baptist Church of Hammond, and everyone else was just like, ugh, like it was all there. You could read it. Like my parents could have read any of this, but they chose not to read it. And then there's the people that just say, oh, that doesn't really apply to me. I don't want to get involved. And then 10 years later, when something happens that you are involved in, you don't believe it because you never did the research. If you had been educating yourself along the way, you would be much more apt to believe allegations coming forward. But you haven't been educating yourself, so now once again, you can deny what is presented before you.
Exactly.
It's you.
Even long after Hiles had left, his habit of covering up abuse and scandal continued to play a part in the way the IFB operated. In December of 2018, journalist Sarah Smith, then a part of the Star-Telegram in Texas, broke the story of over 800 cases of sexual assault covered up by leaders in the IFB movement. The majority of the victims came from churches with ties to Jack Hyles and the First Baptist Church of Hammond, and one survivor who shared her story had been among the many victims of Hyles' own son, David Hyles. The IFB leader moved his son down to Texas after David assaulted several teenage girls and raped the daughter of the president of Hyles Anders College. Jack was very aware of his son's abuse and destroyed letters and other evidence that would have allowed David Hyles to be arrested. It would be 40 years before a survivor of David's abuse would be able to press charges.
So, and that case was just presented this year. So it's still pending, but the charges were formally presented this year, 40 years later. After his removal from Hammond, David Hyles would then go on to have multiple affairs with several women in new churches, along with more allegations of sexual abuse levied against him regarding relationships with teenage girls. His first wife, Paula, left him and gave an interview that corroborated the story told in the Biblical Evangelist. I didn't put this in here, but one of the times that he got caught was because he had a bunch of naked pictures of him and at least one girl. It might have been multiple girls. And then he knew that like the deacons of the church were figuring out. So he puts them all in a briefcase and he throws it away in a dumpster. While the janitor's cleaning it out, he sees a brand new briefcase in the dumpster. And he's like, oh, this is great. Takes it home, opens it up and sees all the naked pictures of David and the women that he was with. Wow. Just like... I mean, the thing about David Hyles was born into what is considered IFB royalty. And as such, he never, whereas his father was much more clever, David Hyles spent his entire life with his dad covering up his tracks.
Right, he didn't have to worry about anything. He could just do whatever the fuck he wanted, and it didn't matter because he was this powerful son, right? And daddy's going to take care of it.
Literally, and that's exactly what Jack Hyles did again and again and again. I mean, in the story of the girl who was raped... she was a daughter of the president of Hyles Anderson College, and they wouldn't believe her. She kept saying, David raped me every time I'm with him. He tries to molest me. And so she set up like a sting operation where she arranged to meet David at a hotel, had her dad there. And then when David showed up, she's like, yep, see, I'm telling you, this man has been harassing me. But even with that, when the president of the college went to his one of Hyles' closest friends goes to him and says, your son has done this to my daughter. Hyles was like, don't worry, I'm going to take care of it. Pays off the dad, basically, and sends David to another church where he does the same thing. For several years, Dave Hyles faded from the IFB spotlight as it became apparent that Jack could do little to reform the image of his son. This was made doubly hard when stories revealed that 2 of David's children had died under mysterious circumstances at separate times. One died in infancy, the other was backed over by a car. Rumors swirled that signs of abuse had been evident in both children, but authorities never gained the evidence needed to formally charge David Hyles. Despite his sordid past, the apple surely doesn't fall far from the tree. In recent years, the son of Jack Hyles has made a striking comeback in the world of fundamentalism. A few years ago, he launched what he calls a restoration ministry, which allows abusers to pay him to put them through a program, label them restored, and connect them to fundamentalist leaders who restore the predators to a position of power within the IFB. That's also where he rehabilitates gay people as well, if you want to deal with that.
As for Jack Hyles, while he certainly lost some of his power among the independent fundamental Baptists, he still reigned strong with his own empire until his death in 2001. He was succeeded by his son-in-law, Jack Scott, who went to prison. Jack Scott, who went to prison 11 years later for sexually abusing a 16-year-old girl. The story of Hyles' abuse was covered by the WJBK news station in Detroit, Michigan in 1993. In a 6-part series titled Praying from the Pulpit, the news anchors detailed the cult that FBC Hammond had become. Over the years, several journalists have also written about the Hyles and later Scott. It's Shop. He just told you it was Scott just to be an asshole.
Maybe.
He was like, I know everybody's going to pronounce it Shop, but I'm going to tell him it's Scott, so that way I can be an asshole. In 2012, Jack Hyles' own daughter, Linda Hyles Murphy, gave a TEDx talk about her father's cult. Blogger James Perrin, the founder of the LGBT publication Esteem, was friends with the Hyles children when he was younger. He later wrote about the hypocrisy of the Hyles clan's hatred and expectations of queer people while justifying their own sexual desires. In an article for Medium, Perrin wrote about fundamentalist double standard. Gay men are supposed to be able to resist temptation, and if they don't, it's their fault. They are the ones condemned. Only straight men get to blame the objects of their desires when they refuse to control themselves.
Yeah, I mean, because it's the thing. It's like, if you're LGBTQ and you grow up in the world of fundamentalism, you have to just deny. There are even people are to the point now, some of them who will say, look, I understand. I think you're born gay and God wants you to fight this temptation. It's just like any other sin, blah, blah, blah.
But then if they molest a girl, it's the girl's fault for
exactly.
taunting them or for encouraging them for being, her skirt was just a little too high.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I didn't add it in here, but Perrin even said, it's like if you're a gay man and you're in a locker room and somebody walks next to you and is naked, if you were to attack that man, no one would say it was the other man's fault. You're expected to be around gay, like naked men all the time, especially in the male environment, and just control yourself. But a woman sits with her skirt slightly too short, or she has a pants that are too tight, or her dress is slightly low, and suddenly that gives you
permission to assault her.
Exactly.
And we'll cover it up for you.
Yes, we'll cover it up. We'll justify. We'll restore you. Blah blah blah, and it'll be fine. And so, just again, that extreme hypocrisy. And I didn't put it in here, but I did put it in here. He died in 2001, and then it was his son Jack Scott that I sat under until 2011, and then it was the following year that Scott was arrested for abusing the girl. Mm-hmm. So, your recommended resource for this part is the 6-part series Praying for the Pulpit, which is available on YouTube, or Sarah Smith's Star Telegram piece about the hundreds of sexual abuses cases in the IFB. And I also linked all of that, of course, in the script you can find on yourqueerstory.com.
Yep.
Yeah,
pretty eye-opening.
Pretty eye-opening. Next week we're going to wrap up the series with the 2 men who are most prominent in today's day, Fred Phelps from Westboro Baptist Church and Stephen Anderson from Faithful Word Baptist Church. So,
rest in misery, Fred Phelps.
Exactly.
Don't forget about the pink mass who turned your ancestors gay.
The pink mass that turned your ancestors...
Yeah, the Satanic Temple did a pink mass that turned Fred Phelps' ancestors gay. The leader dropped his nuts on the grandma's tomb. It was like, your grandma's gay now.
Oh, God. Fred Phelps. He's such a hated man. And he really didn't even have that much power in the IFB. He did not have much power at all. He was just very loud.
Yes, and the loud people always get the most attention.
They do. So, anyways, but we'll be back next week and we will wrap it up. So...
stay queer.
Don't get a lobotomy.
We love you, our little allied hookers.
Little succulent sapphires.
Resist the oppressors, and the IFB are proud homocrats.
And have yourself a sodomy revival.
Or don't, and Black Lives Matter.
Bye.
Bye.